You ever have that one series that just seems to evade you? Like, you always hear people talking about it and singing its praises, and heck, every time you see it you think to yourself, man, that looks like it's really fun, and yet time and time again, no matter how much you try, and no matter how much you struggle, you just can't get into it. Well, for me, that series has always been none other than Nintendo's beloved, then neglected, then beloved again, Metroid series. The games always looked so cool and ominous. They used this style that was different from anything else Nintendo offered. Heck, my interactions with the Metroid series as portrayed in the Super Smash Bros. Series always left a huge impression on me. I remember thinking Samus looked so cool, and I remember how much Brinstar Depths scared me for some reason as a kid. I'm not joking. Kraid absolutely terrified me, but it left an impression, probably because I was a big baby that was scared of Luigi's Mansion at the time even. And yet, time and time again, I would pick up a Metroid game, get excited to experience the wonders that lay just beyond that case, play it for a couple hours, and inevitably leave frustrated and confused. I just didn't get Metroid. And so for years, I would watch from a distance, almost salty that I couldn't get into this series. I would grow ever more aggravated as I watched by the wayside, and would even begin to feel a bit of disdain to the series as I saw one of my favorite games released on the Wii U become nothing more than a punching bag for the enraged Metroid fans. I didn't understand what the big deal was because I wasn't a part of the fanbase itself. I think this is a common issue in general. People can never really put themselves in the shoes of fans of another series. I've been there, trust me. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people whining about the Fire Emblem series, despite the fact that most people won't even give the series a shot. And so it was that no matter what I tried, no matter what I did, I would never ever be a fan of Metroid. Or at least, that would have been the case. Because ironically, this same return every fan waited years and years for, the long-awaited light at the end of the tunnel for starving Metroid fans, would finally be the one to crack through that impenetrable wall. Suddenly, my eyes were opened to a whole set of games to fall in love with. After months of digging into each and every Metroid game, learning what makes them tick, and growing a ridiculous fondness for the series, I couldn't just stay still. And so, after a bit of deliberation, I decided I had enough. As a newcomer, I'm diving full into the series to give you my thoughts as a person who never so much as beat a Metroid game 2 years ago. Welcome, everyone, to my 2D Metroid series Game Over Analysis Retrospective. Let's get started. In the year who knows what, an organization known as the Space Pirates end up attacking a Federation-owned ship that just so happened to have some samples of these creatures known as Metroids. They're these weird jellyfish-like creatures that can latch onto any life form regardless of armor, and literally suck the life out of them. Sounds dangerous, right? Well, the Space Pirates sure thought so, as they wanted to use these creatures to destroy everyone in their path. Of course, the Galactic Federation wasn't too thrilled about that idea, so they decided the best plan of action was to send one lone bounty hunter by the name of Samus Aran to go take down the Space Pirates. Specifically their leader and the brains of the operation, as in a literal brain, Mother Brain. And that's it, you got a mission, go destroy the Space Pirates and be back before lunch. I like the startup of this game quite a bit. You land on this planet to take these pirates down, and as you do so, you're met with this glorious, adventurous theme. This fits so well thematically, as at this point the area is new and unexplored. There's a layer of adventurous spirit in the music, making the start have such a nice impact. The music as well deserves note throughout the entirety of the game actually. As you delve further in, things get more and more freaky, and the music changes alongside it, adding a brilliant layer of atmosphere building in a way not present in games from this era most of the time. NES games were usually upbeat and happy, so the fact that Metroid pulls off this creepy atmosphere so well is quite an accomplishment to be sure. Upon starting the game, I wasn't 100% sure what exactly I'd be getting into. You see, I'm not exactly too fond of the NES if I'm being honest. While there are a good chunk of games that I think are genuinely fun, I've found that the NES library was a bit different from what I look for in games. I grew up during the GameCube era, where checkpoints were frequent, saving was a requirement, not a luxury, games were straightforward, and most importantly, games were actually, beatable. Call me a casual-tastic loser all you want, but honestly, I find the NES's focus on tough-as-nails design and cryptic puzzle design to be a bit obnoxious. And considering that I couldn't even figure out how to deal with the original Zelda's cryptic design, I was terrified as to what would come of the first Metroid. The funny thing is, it really wasn't quite as big of a problem as I was expecting, actually. Unlike a lot of games of its era, it relegates the vast majority of the more cryptically focused puzzles purely on power-ups. Sure, occasionally I did find a random upgrade in a wall and go, gee, I wonder how I was supposed to find that if I wasn't just messing around like this, but when it comes to purely beating the game as is, there really isn't much of that cryptic design as I expected. In fact, things were generally telegraphed really well. You find a red door that won't open? Well, head a little ways down and bam, you find the missiles and can continue down the way. If you ever get stuck, usually the solution is to just mentally retrace your steps. What have I seen that would let me use one of these power-ups I got? Usually this was enough to give me a shove in the right direction, and at worst, there was always a missile expansion or an energy tank for my troubles if the trek truly proved to be the wrong way to progress. Now these are all standard hallmarks of the Metroidvania design, but what's so impressive is that not only was this basically the first Metroidvania, but that despite being on the NES, it never quite falls to the same cryptic garbage that ruined several games on the system for me. It's honestly kind of impressive that they managed it. Unfortunately, being on the NES caused a problem that I didn't quite foresee, but probably should have considering the circumstances. Sometimes I'd walk into a room and think, man, haven't I seen this room before? I mean, that can't be, this is a completely different area. But I was right. Some of the rooms are, no joke, almost exactly the same as several others in the game. Whether it be due to limited memory or a limited budget, you'll find yourself trekking through the same room layout up to 5 times in some cases. Now, maybe this wouldn't be as big of an issue, but for some bizarre reason, the game actually has no map either. This makes traversing through the game an absolute mess, as it's actually really hard to find the exact room you're looking for when there's 4 others just like it. Metroid became kind of a slog for a while, if I'm being honest. Later in the game, I'd get an upgrade and just roam around for a long time trying to find where exactly I was supposed to use it in the first place. After a while, I straight up gave up trying to play without a map and just opened one up on Google, and even then, it wasn't exactly ideal. At the time, this game was probably really impressive, mind-blowing even, but held to today's standards, the game suddenly seems ridiculously outdated in a number of ways. In general, I've noticed this pattern that the more ambitious the game is at pushing the boundaries of what is possible at the time, the worse it ages over time as well. Metroid 1 is undeniably an important game, but I'm not sure it's really a fun one. And trust me, this extends to a lot more than just the level design itself. Combat in this game is not exactly exhilarating to begin with so few options and with the weirdly floaty controls, dealing with enemies becomes a bit of a chore as the game goes on for a number of reasons. First is that some enemies have sprites that are way too small. Every time I had to deal with these stupid zigzagging enemies, I just tried to avoid them because trying to hit them with Samus's 2-direction pea shooter was just a waste of time. Other enemies are either too low to actually deal with, have annoying patterns, or ironically are the reverse, so easy that it feels kind of pointless to call them an enemy. There's not a good balance here. The way I've always looked at it is, if I actively avoid fighting enemies in a game, that's usually a sign that the combat wasn't designed well. Though part of the problem may be that I played every single other 2D Metroid game before this one. Oops. The other problem with dealing with enemies has to do with Samus's health. Now, I'm not opposed to a bit of challenge. Taking solid chunks of damage is fine. Fusion was pretty brutal at times, so it's not really that bad that the enemies hit hard. It was that recovering health in Metroid is absolutely horrendous. The only way to consistently get any health is to camp out at these enemy spawners and knock them out over and over until your health is refilled. The problem is that the drop rate is way too low, and even once you get some health, it's always a small chunk. And so you just sit there for minutes on end grinding out enemies in the hopes that you can finally get back to the game. And if you accidentally get hit during this, that's just 20 more seconds you gotta waste trying to fix that mistake. I'm sorry, but this is just boring. I don't even get why you would design it like this in the first place. There's nothing beneficial about this at all, it's just mindless filler. Well, actually, I guess maybe there is one thing that's nice about this. I can listen to the music, I guess. The soundtrack to Metroid is really catchy by NES standards. To be fair, I had heard some of these arrangements before in Super Smash Bros. Prior to playing this, but regardless, there's no doubt that these tunes are classic for a reason. Special mention should go to the track Brinstar Depths, which is by far my favorite track in the game. It's honestly kind of impressive that they made sure they could cram in as much atmosphere that the NES could feasibly allow. Even if on occasion the tracks could be a bit annoying. Ridley, I love you man, but how the heck does this theme constantly playing not give you a headache? maybe that's why Ridley's so mad all the time, who knows. I guess while I'm talking presentation, I could talk briefly about the visual design. Much like a lot of NES games, the design is very simple, leaving a lot to the imagination. I'm not particularly fond of this game's art style, as it's not really atmospheric at all. The rooms just look kinda odd with these weird bright colors and repeated structures. It's not exactly befitting of a game in the Metroid series. I also don't really like the design of Samus in this game, but the chunky model is more likely caused by the lack of power in the hardware, so I'm willing to let it slide for now. You certainly could do a lot worse visually, but it's not really my cup of tea either. But anyways, I managed to make it all the way to the final stretch of the game. After dealing with a long stretch of hallways with many, and I mean many Metroids attempting to eat me alive, I finally reached Mother Brain. I was initially really excited to take her down, but then I actually fought the boss. I'm just gonna come out and say it, I hate this boss with a burning passion. The design of it is just all over the place, with these dumb rings going all around the screen, and all these projectiles trying to knock you out of the way. With all that's going on in the boss fight, it just feels like a cluttered mess, where getting through is more of a test of your patience than any skill you might have. Worse still is that even in the remake of this game, the fight really isn't any better. But whatever, it's just one fight, and what happens after is at least worth the hassle. The base starts to self-destruct, and so Samus must make her way out of the base before the entire thing blows up, taking her with it. These escape sequences would become a hallmark of the series as a whole, and I gotta admit, it never fails to get me pumped up. There's nothing quite like rushing out of the place you just explored, only to see it blown to smithereens. Especially by this point of the game, where Samus has enough power-ups and upgrades at her disposal, where the game has gone full circle from being adventurous, to ominous, to creepy, back to adventurous and exciting. I think this caps off the game quite wonderfully if I'm being honest. But you know, I mentioned the remake earlier, and that kinda begs an interesting question. Is this game worth playing even despite having a remake that fixes everything about it, with the exception of the final fight? This is the question that remained in my mind during the entire playthrough. I've given it a lot of thought over the past couple weeks, and I think I've finally come to my answer. I think that while the game is certainly a neat novelty, I don't really think it's worth trekking through unless you're a really big fan of the series as a whole. Let's look at it this way. The game is highly flawed. While the game certainly isn't as cryptic as many games from its era, it lacks a good sense of direction. It's never exactly clear where you're supposed to be heading, as sometimes upgrades required in one area may inexplicably require backtracking to an area without any real thing pointing you in that direction. Not helping is the large amount of repeated rooms, which not only gets visually drab, but makes it even harder to identify where you have and haven't been, especially without a map. The combat and controls can be a bit finicky as well, making the game a lot more tedious to play as a whole. But the biggest issue is that everything this game does well is not only done in its Remake Zero mission, but it's done better. And all those problems I mentioned earlier, they were fixed as well, and with a much prettier coat of paint as well. This game started a genre, sure. And yes, it started the series as well. That's great and all, but I don't think that should completely bar it from criticism. This game is flawed, and for a casual fan of the series or someone trying to get into the series, this doesn't really serve much of a purpose when a remake exists that does everything better. I don't necessarily think it's not worth checking out at all, as it certainly is neat at least, but I feel like it's better served to someone who's already a fan of the series. Regardless, this entry would start a series unlike any other at the time, literally starting a new genre. And of course, with the first game being a success, it only made sense to continue the series. But unlike a lot of its peers, its next game would not appear on the NES. Instead, it would be the series' first appearance on a handheld system in Metroid 2: Return of Samus. Would this Game Boy game fall to the same issues that plagued its predecessor? Would it turn out to be a surprising and forgotten gem in a library full of them? Well, find out next week when we cover Metroid 2: Return of Samus. Until then, I guess that's game over. Analysis. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed. And hey, if you like this video, why not check out my previous video on Deltarune? Or check out some of these reaction videos I did, or my video on Death Note games. They're all pretty good. Anyways, stay tuned for the next video. See you later.